my intro to psychedelics was that I had a friend who sold $500 million company, traveled the world to find himself, and did psychedelics, specific psilocybin, in order to figure out the answers to great questions in his life. I've talked to a lot of people who've done the exact same. So, and even Steve Jobs said that dropping acid was one of the 2 or 3 important things that he's done in his life. So I thought to myself, I might as well explore. So I'm hoping this conversation would be, mostly centered around psilocybin, and its effects on magic mushrooms and its effects. So I'll talk about my stories, and Banu, you tell your stories and all your friends. So let's talk about first how I got into it and what my experience was. First, the difference between the two. I felt so. I guess I'm pretty sensitive to mushrooms because I only took 2 grams, and at 2 grams, my body started spasming like crazy. Like I felt like it was like this electric shock because I was on sensory overload. Like it was like my nervous system could feel absolutely everything. It wasn't as bad as when I took 3 tabs of LSD, but it almost got to that point. And because I was spasming a lot because I felt like this electric shock was going through my body for the first little bit, to keep my mind off of my body going like absolutely crazy, I was talking and I was giggling. And during that period of time, I thought I could potentially have a bad trip because I was in a bad state of mind, but I didn't. And in fact, I kept on talking with the person I was having a trip with, how much of a piece of shit I was. And I was laughing at myself. I was laughing at myself so much. And what I found is that the similarities between psilocybin and LSD was that it allowed you to open up a lot of references that you can tap into. So in the sense that...
I think let's stop there because I want to talk about that experience. That is interesting. So you were able to look at yourself in a completely new way and find the kind of humor in it,
right,
rather than feeling bad about it. Is that what the experience was for you?
Yeah, it was way more funnier than bad. Yeah, I was just laughing at myself. I was just like, "Oh, Tony, you piece of shit! You did this, this, and that." So I just laughed at myself. Yeah.
And if you look at what happens in the brain, that may explain that experience. So when we look at what happens to the brain under psilocybin, and they had these studies where they would give the subjects psilocybin and then put them under brain imaging, and then they figured out there's a part of the brain we call default mode network that is responsible for creating a story of self, right? The thoughts around the self, also mental time travel going to the future and to the past, and creates an autobiographical memory, right? The story of who we are sits over there. And also a lot of thinking, judgments, blaming of self and others also sits there, the moral judgments. And this is where our mind goes when we are not focusing on something else. When we are not actively doing anything else, the brain seems to start this network. That's why it's called default mode network. By default, if you are not doing anything else, that's what we use in our brain.
So default network is that when we're not doing anything else, we tend to look inwards to...
Yeah, that's when one mind wandering occurs, right? When you're not focusing on something else, our mind goes away somewhere. Even when we need to focus on something else, like at school, that would happen a lot, like when you're in a daydreamy place.
Got it.
Thinking things, you're in that space. So that's the default mode network. And under psilocybin, what seems to happen is the blood flow to that area and the neural activity in that area decreases significantly. And
okay. Interesting.
So it takes the activation down from that default mode network. And if the trip is strong enough, if you took the psilocybin in enough levels of it, it can create what they call an ego death, meaning that strips a sense of self, because the default mode network that creates the self does not really function at that moment in time. So you don't have to look at things from a perspective of self. And when you don't have to do that, and when you don't have to perceive everything from a filter of your story of who you are, the way you see things and understand things change drastically when you take self out of the equation. Right? And for an adult, it's very difficult to do under normal conditions. Why? Because the more you use these networks, the stronger they become. And by the time you're an adult, you have these neural networks that gets triggered. It's the same loop you're using. Everything you think about something particular, let's say, it takes you through the same mental pattern, same loop. Because now by that time, you are, like you're habituated in your neural networks, so you cannot really come with fresh perspectives in the real sense, right? Because that network is solidifying with time and with usage. And what seems to happen when we take psilocybin, other psychedelics, is because this area is suppressed, all of a sudden, when a thought occurs, it cannot travel its usual route. So it has to create a new route. So the brain uses different parts and different neural networks. Now you can look at the same thing and create a completely different loop of thinking around it. And it opens our minds, it seems like, for these profound realizations, because we've never been able to look at it in such a different perspective. We get stuck in these loops. And these loops become extremely problematic when we are talking about, for example, anxiety and depressive disorders. Why? Because especially in depressive disorders, you see a higher activation in default mode network. So if you have a pattern about talking, thinking about yourself, you're self-critical, let's say,
right?
And you have these negative patterns, and you keep using it. You're in that loop, turning and makes it worse and worse and worse. And the reason I think psilocybin mushrooms work so far, it seems like amazingly in most cases on depression, is because it breaks that pattern. It allows you to create a new path where your thoughts can travel to, let's say. So you have a chance to break the pattern.
So just as a summary, so that I understand it, we have default mode, and default mode is when we aren't occupied with anything else, and that's usually when we start to think about ourselves and what we've done, start to reflect. But when we take psilocybin, blood rushes to that part of the brain, but also blocks other parts, and then suddenly we're really deep in that, we're discovering much more deeper thoughts, and then because parts of our brain are blocked, that information has to travel to a different route, and that's where the discovery is.
Yeah, like blood doesn't rush to it. Blood is taken away from default mode network.
Oh, okay.
Blood doesn't flow there anymore. So that's why you cannot create, like, you're not stuck in the self-narrative stories that you had built up until that time.
So when you take away blood from default mode, that means there's less default mode.
Yes.
Okay. And then that is what's responsible for why you have less of a sense of self. You have that ego death.
Yes, exactly. Because that area creates the narration, the whole story about the self. And when that part is not functioning, you don't really have that same understanding of self. So that seems to be, again, these are not like super clear. These are more in theories of what's happening, and we have some data because we see that blood flow changes and the neural activity of that part changes. Mm-hmm. But of course, the way we connect it to what's this, relationship to subjective experience, but it makes really sense, right? If the part of the brain that creates the sense of self is not really functioning under psilocybin, like ego death of subjective experience makes sense.
So what's the evolutionary reason to have, and that makes sense, like why default modes attached to a sense of self or ego, Um, what's the evolutionary reason for having default mode to reflect on the past or your sense of self? Because yeah, what's the point of that?
It's in general creating stories. We discussed it in the last chats.
Yeah,
Remember, we need
yeah.
to create some maps to understand the landscape and kind of act on it. And making, tying a sense of self gives us a way to protect ourselves.
Right.
Right? If you don't have a self, you don't have to protect yourself. Like that kind of dissolves as well. And I think I'm speculating here, but I would think that those kind of stories created allows us to create simplified maps and increases our chances for survival in nature as a hunter-gatherer.
And it improves our instincts. So when we don't have ego death, that means we're less likely because that will that's associated with threat, right? So if you have, because ego, from my understanding, is preserving yourself, and one of the strategies to preserve yourself is where you stand in the social hierarchy. So you're always looking for how people threaten you in terms of your survivability. If they like you, they're less likely to harm you than if they don't like you. So I guess the part of ego death is literally feeling that nothing threatens you anymore, and you can kind of take a look at things without that sense of emotion that's attached to it. Because emotion is pretty much our reaction for survivability. That's essentially what it is, right?
Yes, emotions are kind of tools in our system that motivates us to certain behaviors. Emotion helps drive us, and in general, it can be at the end of the day. It can be for individual survival or survival of the species, because we have emotions like love so that we can stay together to stay safe and also reproduce.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And then you have the romantic love and stuff like that. So you can tie all of them to survival of the individual or the species, why the emotions are there. But I think in terms of threat, like we should also talk about the bad trips. It's not like every time you use it you have a complete ego dissolve, or
right.
There are scary things, that threatening things that can happen, and psilocybin trip, right? What you call a bad trip.
Right. Yeah, talk about that, because I haven't had a bad trip. I've probably been on 3 or 4 trips total. And one of them, when I was in psilocybin, I was in a bad state of mind, but I just giggled and laughed a lot. A lot, even though throughout that entire time I was talking bad things about myself, I was laughing at it. And it was great. It felt great as a result. So is it that, a couple of things. What causes a bad trip? What is a bad trip like? Because I've never had one. And who's more prone to it? Because I thought I could have one, but I didn't.
So, number one, the bad trip is said to be therapeutic as well.
Okay.
So it's not like it's bad to have bad trips. Right now, at this point, the clinical consensus on it, even if you're having a bad trip, it's good for you.
Okay. Why is that?
Why is that?
Yeah.
Because one thing that seems to happen under psychedelics is we have more of an access to the subconscious thoughts, emotions, whatever is kind of suppressed, and it doesn't really make its way for us to process with our conscious mind regularly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so because it activates all that, like different parts of the brain, it also allows to stuff to come up. It can be like difficult emotional memories that you may have, or the big fears that you may be normally able to suppress and control and keep it under the lid. They may show up under a trip. And if they show up, sometimes this thing is, it's good because you're facing your demons. And when you're facing your demons, you have a very flexible way of responding to it. Okay, let me talk more about this thing.
Yeah.
To rewire an emotional memory. Let's say you have an emotional memory that is stored. And emotional memory is different than autobiographical memory. It doesn't necessarily have to have the memory that you remember, oh, that day this happened.
Yeah.
But when something happens and there's a, like, let's say, negative emotions associated with it, sometimes we just store that. And we don't necessarily have something that goes with it, right? And they are stored in our emotional memory centers. And if we want to change them, right? If we want to get rid of them, we cannot do it unless we activated those neurons. So to rewire it, first you have to trigger it, activate them. Does it make sense?
Yeah, just so that I understand I understand why other parts were triggering, but just go back to, we are triggering other parts of it because some parts are, because we're no longer rushing blood to our default mode. That's correct?
Yeah, default mode is, okay, think about default mode as a regulator, like an official that really like puts the rules, everybody is going to do that. It's a centralized system.
Yeah.
When we take the psychedelic, all of a sudden the regulator is down. It's like a chaos, it seems like, right? That parts of the brain does whatever they want to do, almost. It becomes decentralized. And we don't know, like there's a lot of things happening in the brain. We see it, we don't understand completely what's going on, but we just know that it seems like different parts of the brain is getting active, doing something, right? When we go back to like difficult emotions, like in a bad trip, you're dealing with, you know, mostly negative emotions. It can be intense sadness, it can be intense fear, right? And there's usually imagery that goes with it. There may be a story that goes with it, like a dreamlike state. For example, one time I had, like everything was black, and then I had this giant snake, like Voldemort and Harry Potter, and like a cobra, and it's standing like that. It's giant, and like we're face to face, and there's these fires everywhere. It's a very strong imagery, right? And like you're face to face with this giant thing and can talk telepathically. And that's why, like, in that second, I was like, oh, this is Voldemort, like kind of a thing, right? Jeez. And so there's this imagery that comes with like this world, everything is fire, so much suffering, and then this snake comes in and looks at me in the face. So I'll take that imagery that my brain created to process some emotion. There's something that sees the world, you know, some part of me looks at the world and the suffering in the world, that things may be wrong in the world. And then there is this snake that signifies that looks at me, right? It gives an image to it, basically. But this gives me an opportunity now, like, because that, in those emotional memories or whatever is leading to these imagery is activated. I have the chance to rewire it, to create a different relationship with it, right? And that's which happened in that, you know, instance where I looked at it and I decided to say, hey, you know, rather than being afraid of that snake. And all of a sudden, hey, like, how are you? Or something like that. And all of a sudden, all the darkness disappeared. And now it was snake, bright daylight. It was like a conversation with this giant snake, and snake was not a threat anymore, right? So my brain probably rewired a fear that I have subconsciously, right? Deep sadness or fear. So to rewire an emotional memory, we need to activate it. And it seems like under psychedelics, we can activate those fears and deep sadness and like really strong negative emotions and rewire them, change our relationship to them. That's why I'm saying it's like facing your demons. You can see it that way, but it gives you an opportunity to change that relationship. That's why the bad trips can be a good thing.
But what if, because it sounded like during that trip, even though you had all this intense fear, during that trip you turned it around while on that trip. What about those people who had that intense fear and didn't resolve it during that trip? Is it that it's resolved afterwards, or is it that it's resolved there and then?
And sometimes we don't really understand. Like in this instance, it was very obvious, but there can be instances where it's not obvious, but still the brain worked on that issue, even if not fully dealt with. It still seems like some therapeutic effect is happening at that time.
Mm-hmm. Is it similar to like when someone is sad, they cry to just let it out and then they feel better? Would you say it's like similar to that or different?
I think it is that, and more about, like, as we said, the brain can come up with completely new ways of looking at this and processing things under psychedelics. So when we are dealing with our problems, I think the brain has a more creative way of solving those problems that we cannot under, and then regular, when we are like having this regular neural networks working on it. So this allows us to come up with creative ways of looking at it and dealing with it.
Right. What are your thoughts on people who have had bad trips and it's been quote unquote scarring to them? Because I've heard the story, and I was going on a trip and I was going to invite my friend, and she got cold feet last minute because she said that her friend was quote unquote with insidious people, and that for that reason he went on a bad trip and he just like has never recovered from it. Like it still affects him to today. You know anything about that?
What is insidious people?
Well, that was the word. Just terrible people, in other words.
Like,
I guess
in real life, he did the. You mean the trip was with real people, or he met?
He was with bad people. Like
So,
he was with a group of people that he didn't like.
Okay, let's talk about that. Like, it's set and setting, right? It is recommended that you don't do this with when you're in a bad place, right? Already you're in a bad place. It's not recommended because it can increase the chances for that. But setting is very important. You definitely want to do it in a place that when you feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're not feeling safe and you're taking such a strong agent, it can create very unpleasant experience. So, like we were talking about this, and I think there's a lot of potential in psychedelics, but I also want to warn people not to take this lightly. These adjuncts has been used for like thousands of years, like 8,000 years. I think psilocybin we know that humanity has been using it for 8,000 years. But when you look at how they used it, it was always in a spiritual and medicinal setting. It was never a recreational, like this is too strong of a thing to use for having fun. Like my opinion is not to really use this recreationally and taking it lightly where you are and with who you are. You want to make sure you're in a safe place where you feel safe and you are actually safe. Mm-hmm. That's very important. And it's good to have someone sitting with you that is kind of like in therapeutic setting. When you look at the research, there's always someone who is, who's sober, is sitting for that person who has taken the mushrooms. So I think it's important to have that, because if the person needs support, you're going to a bad trip, there's like very high levels of anxiety, that sitter, that guide can help the person to like safely get out of that. Yeah. So that's why you need like your shamans in all traditions, right? There's always someone to guide you, to sit with you. It's not like something you take by yourself and just everyone takes and like have giggles and stuff like that. And on that point, most people I know use these psychedelics in a place like, oh, let's do it with friends. It's a fun way of spending a day because there's a lot of perceptual changes, mm-hmm. right? That can be amazing. right? It is fun. Like, do you have an experience like that where perceptually you started perceiving the
Yeah.
world in a very different way?
Well, you basically start seeing, I mean, physically you start seeing weird things happening in front of you. So one of the stories I had was that you did, but a lot of it was because the ego element is out of it. And because the ego element is out of it and you have no sense of self and you have no sense of self-preservation, where you sit in this hierarchy, you're able to just let things be as opposed to letting things go, as my friend Jason would say. That was the biggest thing out of it, though. That was really the big thing. You just really didn't care. That's what I felt. And I've only did psilocybin once. I did LSD, so the experience might be very different. I was definitely more giggly, so I'll talk about psilocybin. But I can definitely tell you that I was giggling a lot. I was laughing a lot. And, one of the big breakthroughs about being able to laugh at yourself while also on mushrooms was that you was that I had learned that a lot of my fears that I have in terms of interacting with people, why I hold things back, why I present a certain way, is because I was in this, I guess, I was worried because of that quote unquote threat. If they hurt my ego, they're more likely to hurt me, or they're likely going to hurt my chances at a career, or they're likely going to hurt my chances at the social hierarchy. And all those things are actually very vital to me in a subtle way, in a deep, deep rooted way for me to progress, thrive, and survive. And you can only survive if you progress. And so by being rejected from a group, by rejecting from a potential job, that fear is so ingrained to you that the moment you take psilocybin or any type of psychedelic, it is so gone that now I can laugh at myself. And then after I got out of the trip, I thought to myself, man, if only I could laugh at myself when I'm sober and not in the trip. Because people really resonate with other people if they're at a state of ease.
Yeah, that's the beauty of the psychedelics, especially psilocybin, because now you created a different neural network on how to deal with the negative thoughts about yourself, right? Your imperfections or your weaknesses, let's say, right? And under psilocybin, also, like, we have like a very strong memory of those experiences, which is a blessing or curse if you had a bachelor. And now you're able to use that because you created a new neural path to process, how to deal with your own imperfections, right? It happened during the trip and you can think about it and remember it right now. Do you remember how it felt?
Yeah, I remember how it felt. The question is, how do you maintain it? Like, so I'm going to talk about LSD, but I'm sure it's related to psilocybin with that sense of ego death. I remember walking in a park by myself, and I was on this hill, and on this hill there was a lot of people around me, and I stood there close to a lot of people, looking out in the distance and just observing. And because I didn't feel like I was part of this world, because I had experienced that sense of ego death, and I just felt like nothing really bothered me. I realized that at that point, I would have otherwise been checking my phone, looking around, make sure everything was okay, looked around again, pretended to be a little bit busy as I'm quote unquote trying to relax and enjoy the view. But even as I'm in the normal state, still trying to enjoy the view, I'd still be conscious about people around me. And one of the things I noticed when I was on psychedelics was that I noticed that everybody was looking at each other and assessing the threat level. And at that moment, I realized that because I had experienced ego death, I wasn't looking for threat level. I wasn't looking for anybody who could threaten me. And I was completely at ease, even though I was close, I guess uncomfortably close, to a lot of people. But what I've also noticed, what I've observed, because you are super hyper aware when people look at you when you're on a psychedelic, is that nobody looked at me. And I thought that was very interesting. In a different state of mind, I would have looked for everybody to look at me and feel uncomfortable. But in this state of mind, I noticed that nobody even noticed me. And so I think what happens is that if you're looking for a threat, everybody will sense that you're looking for a threat, and then you become the threat. And so there's this almost uncomfortable body language that's exchanged in terms of that energy. But if you proceed where you don't believe anybody's a threat, they won't believe that you're a threat. And that was a big breakthrough that I found. In the
That's
same way,
exactly what we discussed last week, wasn't it? About intimidation
right.
and how your threat system, if you have fight or flight system, especially fight system activated, the other people are going to see you as threat and intimidated by you, especially if you are higher in the hierarchy and if you're strong.
Right.
I also want to also talk about that nuance. I think that's important to have like that fresh, perspective and awareness how that dance work between people, right? But not necessarily we don't want to take this system away and not ever have this, right? Like it's not like we want to live our life, because it can be dangerous. You don't want to be that person who never thinks nobody is going to be a threat to you.
Right.
That, that can endanger your survival, right? This is not like a mental framework we want to keep, but what we do at Psychedelics, it's not like we got to live our lives like that. It opens a window, right, to understanding, to a level of awareness or new ways of dealing with things. Like when you form the different relationship to your imperfections by finding it funny, right, all of a sudden. And you experience that there, and you ask the question, like, how are we going to keep it there? Like, okay, I experienced it there, but now that trip is gone, that is gone. It doesn't have to be that way, because the way the neural networks work is the more you fire, the more you use them, the stronger they become. It's about the practice. It's about activating again. So when you remember that experience of laughing at yourself, if you activate that memory and then use it right now to recreate that, right? Because it's still there. That network is there. Activate it and use it for someone today. Like make fun of yourself that happens today. Like let's see if you can use that new, fresh network currently. And the more you practice this, guess what? It's going to become stronger, and then you're going to be able to use it more frequently. So you bring that thing you found in the, during your journey, and make it a part of your life. And especially in ayahuasca ceremonies, they say it a lot, like, this is not where it ends. This is where it starts. This gives you the tools. It gives you the vision. Now it's your job to go and, change your life with the insights and learnings you got.
Yeah, I almost
feel metrics. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But I also kind of feel that, so I've heard a lot of people say that psychedelics is like a shortcut to meditation. So you can achieve whatever, that state of mind through meditation, which I'm still trying to understand how, because I have never successfully meditated in my life before. But if that is true, it's almost like psychedelics is like when you're a bodybuilder, there's steroids and there's the natural way. When you take steroids, you get buff real quick, but the moment you're off of it, it goes back down, right? You're a little bit more stronger than you were at normal state. Whereas when you're a natural bodybuilder, it builds over time, like all the time, and it goes to that state. So steroids like up and then back down, unless you're on it. Whereas, natural bodybuilder takes a lot of time, a few years until you get to that same state.
Yeah. I think it's exactly the same thing, especially at least for psilocybin. Okay. Number one, the meditation and the effects. Yes, because when you look at long-term meditators and when you put them under brain imaging and look at what's happening in their brain, it's similar. Guess what? The activity of default mode network decreases under meditation as well. But this is like we are talking about, people who are good at meditating. When you get into that meditative state, it's a similar thing happening. And shortcut to that deactivation of the but I don't think that's the only thing that's happening. Like there are some differences in psychedelic, and I think there are more other regions gets activated. It seems almost like randomly there's a storm happening. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the default mode network and what happens to it, that dissolving the sense of self and the judgments and all that critical thinking, future past, like under meditation and the meditative state, that also goes away. And so totally like developing a meditation practice is important for that. But I don't see the psychedelics or psilocybin like you mentioned, something like a shortcut, but it has negative effects. So with psilocybin, what happens is, it's very interesting. Psilocybin mimics the serotonin in brain. Serotonin is something we produce in the body. And it almost like completely, I'm sorry?
Quickly before you move on, how's serotonin different than dopamine? I mean, I've always thought that they were the same, but I guess they're not.
No, they are very different neurotransmitters, but let's get in a different, because I don't want to go like,
okay. All right, yeah.
Tangent here. So psilocybin is found, or psilocybin is found in nature, and it's almost like a replica of serotonin. And it's kind of weird. It's almost like, there's one guy we're talking about, it's like copy paste in nature and inside of us. I always find that interesting. And there's like 200 types of mushrooms all around the world that has this adjunct that completely mimics what we have in our body. And it binds to these serotonin receptors. And unlike a lot of the different things that we are using and to treat, for example, depressive disorders, all this medication that we are using, they don't bind there. They are trying to regulate it by a different mechanism that has a lot of toxicity issues, addiction issues. Like, it changes the chemistry of the brain, and it has a lot of negative effects. But we don't see the same thing with psilocybin. So it fits there perfectly, and it doesn't harm the receptor. So as far as we know, there is no negative effects that you would use steroids for short term.
Right, I see.
And I think, but again, it's how you use everything, right? That's why I'm like, I can't really talk much about the recreative use of it. And it's not studied. We don't know the effects, what can happen. You know, like if you're taking and then like unsafe environment, like with a lot of different things, because all the research is done in a format where you are basically going into an internal journey with an eye mask on and blah, blah, blah. So most of the studies we have is with that. And that's why I think it's safer to use it that way. And when you look at the ancient traditions using it, it's always with a shaman, with a guide, and like taking it very seriously. So in that sense, I don't think it's harmful to use it, and it's not addictive. You're not going to create that. Like, it's an intense experience. It's like unlikely that you would want to do it all the time. Like, it can get, stressful, and it's intense. So I'm not worried about people using this as a shortcut and not bringing it. I think for a person who cannot normally meditate, it may be also helpful, like dealing with it with psychedelics is going to make it easier for them to take another route and start meditating. I've seen a lot of people being able to experience their mind in a different way. They made them more interested in meditating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Than this.
Yeah, that's really interesting though.
And also I want to talk about the difference between eyes open and eyes closed.
Yeah, tell me about that. I had mine eyes opened. What is the difference between them? What's the effect on the brain? If there's one?
Yeah. So when you have your eyes open, and if you've taken a psychedelic, it can be very interesting, right? When you look at like a tree leaf, the sunlight, that there's like almost the colors can be brighter, more interesting. You can see the nuances of it. And now, because all these different parts of the brain are talking to each other, the part of your brain responsible for seeing the colors can connect to the taste. So you can taste that color. You can have synesthesia in a color trip. So you have all these interesting and intriguing experiences, right? Which is cool. And you have a good time. And probably you're not going to be processing a lot of the emotional issues and what is in your subconscious. So it leads the journey into a completely different direction where you are dealing with your senses. So you want to shut your senses down as much as possible, like the eyes at least, so that an internal journey begins. And I know a lot of people using recreationally has never done it. Like they don't know what happens when you have your eyes closed. And that's where you're having, and I can tell you, like, that universes that you create and you go to, like, completely different experiences. So it's very powerful. And when you need to get out, like, the way to get out of it, you can always choose to take it off, open your eyes. That's a way of coming back from that. So it gives you like some level of also control. And if you have people, if you have someone sitting for you, you can integrate what just happened. It's important for like strong realizations, right? You come up with it, now you're using it language, putting it language, telling to someone else. By doing that, you're already integrating what happened. Or if you're having a bad trip, you can come out and engage with someone, and then they can help you to safely go back and like ease the anxiety that comes with it. So there are differences in how you use it, what the experience is going to be like.
That's really interesting. Huh. I wonder, is that the same thing with LSD as well, or mostly with psilocybin?
Yeah, I think it would be same with LSD as well. I don't have personal experience of doing it closed-eye LSD, but I think in LSD it gets more like fragmented, like very psychedelic moves of colors, and like what people usually understand when you say they psychedelic, kind of fractals and visual perspectives. Right. When you close your eyes, like for therapeutic use, if you want to go to an internal journey and use it as a therapeutic or self-discovery or a spiritual kind of tool, more like, I know more about psilocybin in that sense and its beneficial effects. But also it's, I think, important to talk about, like, what do we know of their long-term effects, right? Using it one time.
Yeah, are there long-term effects? So for example, do you know anything about in terms of like how often you should do it? So I've read once a month, I've read once a year, like, yeah.
Well, I don't know how frequently you should do it. I wouldn't do it very frequently because I think every experience like this needs to get integrated in the brain. So the brain needs to make sense of it to make it part of life. And if you're doing too frequently, I don't know, there are people with different opinions. In my opinion, there needs to be a good time left for integration. And once the whole experience is integrated, then you would be ready, and it would be different for everyone. But the effects of one-time use, when we look at the studies, actually, let me see if I can pull it up for you. Because I come from, do you know Rockham?
No, I don't.
He's a founder in Toronto as well, and he has a company called Psychology Compass. Amazing resource. Everybody should check it out. And I'm gonna type what I'm gonna be showing you in the comments later. So he created this kind of analysis. Can you? Oops.
Yeah, okay, yes, Psychology Compass. Yep. Review, yeah.
All right, 1 second. Okay, so somewhere here they had a good, all right. Can you see the research?
I can, yeah.
And psilocybin, okay. When we look at well-being and life satisfaction, they found 200% increase at 2 months. This is one dose taken, and they made the assessment 2 months after that experience. And there are different studies with different results, but like you see, like at 6 months, there's 100% increase in well-being and life satisfaction in this study, for example. When you look at anxiety, again, we have different results, but it's between 20% to 600% that it decrease.
I don't see those numbers. I see the article, but I don't see the number that you're looking at.
What do you mean?
I see an article that says the ultimate psychedelics research.
Oh, resume share. Okay, it was stopped.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah?
Yep.
All right.
I see.
So here are the numbers. And so they listed different studies here.
Anxiety.
These are the anxiety numbers.
And then what's that mean by Griffith? Is that the citing of research?
Yes, they are referring to the research done by Griffiths and his team 2016. And then they looked at the depression. So again, they have different findings, but see 80% of people receive the drug show at least some remission compared to those who receive placebo. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of research indicating beneficial effect of one use long term. And then we also know that it creates a long-term personality change in terms of openness to new experiences. So you become more open-minded. So, and it seems to be a long-term effect that doesn't go back. Like you can achieve that with just one time. And they also use it for addictions, for alcohol addiction, approximately 50% reduction in drinking at 25 weeks. That's kind of crazy.
That is crazy.
How effective that is. And cigarettes.
80%.
80% stop smoking at 6 months.
Well, why is that though? I mean, I can understand depression and the rest of them, but what's happening with cigarette? Like, is it because it's, why is that? Because you're looking for a dopamine hit when you're taking alcohol and cigarettes, right? Does it resolve that? Does it resolve addiction?
Honestly, I need to look deeper into that. I never looked at it like why it is working at addiction as much as it does, but we know that addiction is there because it is a way of coping with difficult emotions and states. A lot of people start using it for dealing with that. And if you can create experiences, new ways of dealing with that, you may not need that substance as much.
I wonder if psychedelics, because if it eliminates default mode, because I think one of the reasons why some people are conscious, so it helps with openness, but I wonder if psychedelics helps with conscientiousness, right? Being very conscientious, like very productive and being very, what's the subcategory of conscientious? There's orderly and the other one. The one where you're just working really, really hard and fast. Anyways, there's that where you're like a busy bee, you're like a machine. And the reason why people aren't so conscientious and just super productive is because I think they think too much instead of actually just working, right? They take too much in order to start, and they think too much in terms of every single little small action. That's what I feel, right? I wonder if kind of getting out of that default mode can help with productivity, if that makes sense, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just doesn't help that at all.
I think it depends on what you're doing.
Right.
If you're intrinsically motivated to do the things that you're doing, I would expect your performance to increase. But if you're doing something just because you want to be liked by other people, or like some reward that when you lose that sense of self, it doesn't really matter anymore, then you would be less motivated to do that thing. But I don't think it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right? That it makes it apparent maybe you shouldn't be doing that. You should be doing something that is more aligned with your intrinsic desires. But one thing that it increases that we know is the prosocial behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It makes us feel more connected with others, and it increases the behaviors that is what we call prosocial, kind of helping behaviors towards others, trying to contribute more, which can increase that productivity or doing things for the collective, let's say.
Right. Yeah, because I
right?
know I'm extrinsically motivated. I'm very extrinsically motivated, more so than.
Yeah, but it comes from a sense of connectedness, because when also one thing that happens when you lose the sense of self, it decreases. Guess what happens? You become part of everything else that exists.
That's true.
You sense your connection with other things because your borders are erased right now.
Yeah.
You're part of the whole, like other people, the nature, that creates that sense of oneness. And when you have that sense of oneness, guess what? You're more likely to help others. You're more likely to have pro-social behavior. All right, I know you have to go. We hit the hour mark already. But do you have a last question that we should be covering before we leave? Or closing remarks?
The only closing remarks is that I mean, like, it was very eye opening to me. I think some people overestimate the life changing effects, but and also or they either overblown the fear of it, of how bad it could be, or overblown the life changing effects in just one trip. You're gonna have to do it multiple times, but it's not as bad as you may think. So I think it's just have a little courage, just jump over and just try it, and be in a safe environment with people you trust.
Yeah, I'm not going to join you just pushing. I'm not suggesting, I'm not telling everyone to do it. I'm just telling like this is a very exciting tool that has been taken away from humanity since the war on drugs started, classifying as a Schedule 1 drug, which is ridiculous because compared to legal substances like alcohol,
cigarettes,
the risk of using psilocybin, like health-wise, society-wise, it's almost negligible. So, so I think one message is look at the adverse effects of everything before you're going to use it. But I feel comfortable with psilocybin because there is not much except for like you may have like 1 in 5 can have negative experiences during the trip. But again, there seems to be therapeutic effects to that. But I will also suggest like look at into therapeutic or kind of self-exploration aspects of it rather than the recreational use of it, that there's another option, and I believe more effective option if you are interested in doing it. I think do it in a safe way and so that you don't leave a lot at the table and you really benefit from it, because these are not taken to be lightly kind of substances. I think we should give the respect that they deserve.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just suggest everyone reads and learns a bit more about that. And yeah, one time can change your life and give you a lot of different things, and nothing can happen. So that's one thing with the psychedelics in my experience. No two experiences are the same. Like every single one is completely different. So you cannot really set expectations. You don't know what you're gonna get, but it's a wild ride, definitely.
Well, thank you, Banu. This is fantastic conversation.